Everybody. We'll give everybody a few minutes to get in. I bet everybody is running as late as I am tonight. I've been about 5 minutes behind for about 2 days. Okay, while everybody's joining us tonight, I'd like to go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Yvonne Brannon. I'm chair of Public Schools First NC. We're a public education advocacy group, and we're very happy to have all of you with us tonight for this very important conversation about the teacher pipeline. Joining me tonight is my colleague, Lynn Edmonds, and we are going to take just a few minutes here at the beginning of the program to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the stats and numbers and around the issue of teacher pipeline. We're very happy to have two special guests tonight, and I'll introduce them after Lynn does her presentation. So let's see where we are right now. We've got just a few more people to let in here, and then I think we'll be in great shape to get started. Well, since I've got these photos up next, I am going to go ahead and introduce our guest speakers first and then ask them to give us a few minutes. But I want to introduce my dear friend and someone I admire so much, Bryan Proffitt. Bryan Proffitt is a veteran teacher in history. We have all known him and his involvement over the Durham public school system. Currently, he's vice president of NEA. And joining him tonight for this conversation is Amanda Boshoff, and Amanda is a principal at the Salem Middle School in Wake County, and she's also was assistant principal at Cary High before now, and a veteran teacher herself in the classroom for about 10 years. So Lynn, I'm going to give you an opportunity to share a little bit of this information with our guests.
Thanks. And there's not many of these slides, you all. We just felt it was important to frame our discussion on this topic of our teacher pipeline. So this first slide that you see is our, or not our, we're at the bottom, as noted by that big old arrow at the bottom of your screen. These are the average starting salaries in our neighboring states. And this speaks for itself. I won't read these numbers to you. And in North Carolina, this is our teachers just make, far less than comparable college graduates with similar level of education, 25.3% less. And here we see the decline in education programs in the UNC system, but for the last 11 years or 9 years, I guess, 2012 through 2021. The color key is on the left side of your screen, with the blue noting bachelor's degrees, the red are master's degrees, and the yellow are our doctoral programs. That one is relatively flat. And I'd like to say about the master's degree, keep in mind that North Carolina no longer offers extra pay for master's level teachers, but you just see this decline, which is very alarming. And here we see that this one is harder to read. I know that. We're sorry that the print is so small. We have a new hot off the presses fact sheet about our teacher pipeline, and that's where this data comes from. You can find that fact sheet on our website. But this shows that our schools in the North Carolina UNC system that predominantly serve minority students have seen the sharpest decline and have been especially hard hit by kids not going into teaching as a profession. And then finally, before we turn it over to Bryan, and Amanda to, share with us. This is a look at, if you'll remember, the General Assembly did away with the Teaching Fellows program that we had for many, many years. It was nationally acclaimed. It was well known across the country. And that original program had focused on all subject areas. It was called the Teaching Fellows program, and it was offered at 17 schools and universities. So when the General Assembly brought it back, I believe in 2015, I might have that year wrong, but oh, it's right there on the screen, 2017, and it's in its current form. It has a focus on STEM and special education, and it's only offered at 8 of our universities and schools. And that's problematic. And we believe and feel that this program needs to be just as robust as what we used to have. And it needs to be well funded, and that will be a huge help for our teacher pipeline.
So one of the things I'd like to ask everybody to do as we get ready to get started here is be thinking of questions you'd like to ask our guests. Lynn's going to be paying attention to questions you put in the chat, and we'll also allow you to raise your hand. Bryan, one of the things that I would like for you to start us off with is kind of tell us how we got to this situation that we're talking about, a broken pipeline, that we're talking about a teacher's pipeline. Where have we been? Kind of how did we get here? And help our audience understand what the issue really is.
Sure. Yeah, Yvonne, I think there's actually 2 different approaches I think we can take to the question, and I might start with one and then pass it to Amanda, and I suspect she'll probably be in the other one, and then I can maybe kind of ping back and forth on that, because I think there's some really, really big picture questions, and then I think there's some very specific, kind of North Carolina, the last 10, 15 years kind of things. And I think it's really important to ground ourselves in both. So I think the first thing to name that feels really important, it feels like actually it feels like starting off with a story feels like the right way to exemplify this. So I don't know if folks remember very well, but when the pandemic started, right, there was all of this debate about whether or not we should be opening schools, right? This is in March and April and May of 2020, right? And every single one of these articles, without fail, I never read a single one of them that did not do exactly what I'm about to describe. The entirety of the debate about whether or not schools should be open was whether or not COVID had an impact on young children. Every article you read, the CDC, any kind of public health agency, anybody who was exploring it was talking about whether or not schools should be open based entirely on the notion of whether or not young people were getting the disease or not, right? While we knew that adults were dying by the thousands every single day, but there was no conversation in any of these articles, in any of these websites, in any of these newscasts about the adults that were going into those buildings and how do we take care of those folks and keep them safe. So we have this whole school system where we have the adults who work and live inside of it. We don't care about them as humans, right? And so I think there's a historical, kind of roots of sexism that are behind that, right? So like we live in a society where the work that it takes to get people to work every day, right? The work of feeding people, clothing people, nurturing them, helping people kind of get through the tough stuff. That is work that as a society we say is quote unquote women's work. And that work is unpaid. And so that care work that women are doing every single day, unpaid in our society, that our society depends upon, we've kind of just turned public schools into an extension of that, right? And so if you look at these professions like public schools, that are highly sort of focused on, women centered as the people, in the profession, you see underpaid and you see an exploitation, right, of people's labor, because there's a notion, because everybody knows that this women-centered profession is not going to let kids fail, right? And so there is something that is about, we can just put upon and put upon and put upon all of these women who are staffing our schools, because at the end of the day, they will take care of kids instead of taking care of themselves. And I think that's a really, really, really bad model, right? So I think the first thing that we got to do is we got to think about the role that sexism plays in our society. Additionally, and like the slides that Lynn named, there's huge swaths of people in our society that cannot see themselves reflected in the teaching profession, and we don't have the institutions built to make that happen. So in this case, I'm talking largely about African American and Latino people who live in North Carolina, right, who are not getting the resources in their schools to talk about how you could step into this profession. They're not getting the kinds of supports. They're not getting the kind of like exposure. They're not getting the kind of like considerations and particular focus on recruitment that we need to have. So we've got a profession that is built upon exploitation, right? That sort of locks Black and brown people out, right? And then in the last 40 years, there's just been a nonstop drumbeat of attacks on public schools to say public schools are failing, public schools are failing, public schools are failing, public schools are failing. And I don't know about y'all, but when you're working a 60 to 70 hour week every week doing the most important and the most difficult job on the planet, and all you hear every single day from the entire sort of machine of society is that you are a failure, and there is no discussion about how the society is failing our kids and sending our kids to us without the resources that they need and setting us up for failure, no conversation about that. Why would someone continue to walk back into the hardest job in the world and be treated like that every single day? So I want to name those things as like bigger picture things that have been kind of in the works for decades, and some cases even centuries. And then I imagine, Amanda will probably cover some of the more kind of shorter term and immediate things, and then I can also kick back to there as well. But I don't want to steal all the possibilities here, so I'll pass it to Amanda. But I do think that there are some real fundamental questions about our society that impact why people do or do not go into the profession of teaching.
Yeah, I'll echo everything that Bryan said. And, during pandemic, we are seen as something that's a given. Like, I know I should be able to send my kid to school so that I can work, yet not treated like we are that essential service. And so I think the teacher pipeline was, well developed or lacking prior to pandemic, and that's made that even worse. And so now, we're starting to recover, but the pipeline is just not there. And so as we're looking at it, we've really got to do a lot to change the message about what it is to be a teacher. We've got to focus more on celebrating public education, and we've got to inspire folks to come back into the mix, even though they see what's happening in the news and in schools. You can talk to students every day. And all of us are probably here because we were inspired by a teacher that we had or encouraged to be a teacher. And you don't hear that anymore. You see teachers now that care about kids so much, they're like, hey, maybe you shouldn't do this. And we're discouraging kids. And so really, we've got to reframe the message that this public education, there's so many good things happening. We've got to celebrate those things. We've got to show those things. It's also been a little more difficult not having parents and visitors in schools the past couple of years because they're not seeing those things. And so as we are trying to open up schools more, just changing that messaging to build that pipeline back is what I see kind of in the immediate. And I'll just echo, as a former teaching fellow myself, that was an opportunity coming out of school where somebody identified me and said, hey, you should do this. Going into it, you're not going to make money. It's really difficult to saddle yourself with 4+ years of college debt. And so for a lot of kids, this would be a really viable option if that funding were there. And, like Bryan said, it needs to be, and Yvonne, it needs to be at every public university in North Carolina, especially HBCUs. And when we saw the reiteration of teaching fellows, that's not what we're seeing. And that's what we really need to do to get the pipeline back up and running.
And we should point out in the teaching fellows that they did add a few schools this year. When we say 8, most of those schools aren't up and running yet. They've recently added these schools to the list, and they were not any HBCU class schools 2 years ago or even a year ago. And I think they are identified now. And I do want to talk about that for a minute, going back now to how we got here. When we look back at 2008, Bryan, we were like, nationally ranked 25th and 23rd and 24th in the nation in teacher pay and per pupil expenditure. So what happened in 2008, we had the recession, we understand that. And then 2011, take us over this last 10 years to how we undermined the basic structure of teaching.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it feels really important, Yvonne, to know. I don't know if you know this, but the first year that I tried to get a job teaching, I was still working for a moving company, unpacking boxes 2 weeks into the school year because I couldn't get a job. I just couldn't find one, right? And that's in 2004 that I could not find a teaching job with a master's degree and 2 years of college teaching experience until 2 weeks into the school year, right? Because all the positions were filled up. So, and I stepped into that profession with every year I was going to get a step increase in my pay. And every year I was going to get a cost of living increase on top of that percentage, right? And so it was a profession that people could step into and sort of think about an evolution economically that would allow you to sustain it over a long period of time, allow you to have a family, allow you to eventually, own a house, something like that, right? So what we saw in 2008, and I think it's important, Yvonne, that you named the recession, right? Because there's also this way in which we say like, oh, well, of course we stopped funding schools because of the recession. Like, it's not an of course, right? Like when the recession happened, there were very intentional choices made by people in power to put the resources into the banks, right? And put the resources into holding up the top end of the economy rather than putting those resources into the bottom. So we actually saw the state of North Carolina start to defund public schools before the right-wing takeover of our state legislature in 2010. And I have to say that was a poor choice that is made by Democratic Party leadership across this country, right? And so it wasn't about what do we need to survive. It was about how do we keep the folks on the top of this economy surviving. And so what started to happen is this thing that we say, oh, well, there's a recession. Well, of course, that's going to hurt the folks at the bottom the worst, right? So I think we need to challenge this notion that was the inevitable response. So first that, right? My pay gets cut in 2008 and I have a 5-year pay freeze for like the 2nd through the 7th year of my career, which means I took a pay cut every single year because the cost of living goes up and my check is exactly the same every single month for 5 years, right? So a lot of people couldn't sustain that. Then in 2010, right, there was the backlash against North Carolina's election of Obama, right? And we saw this racist kind of movement across the country to push back on Obamacare, right? And what happened was it put people into power in state legislatures all over the country. And when that happened, which was a very, very coordinated strategy, and when that happened, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, right, which is funded by the Koch brothers, took every piece of legislation that they had already had on the books that they were already waiting to use to privatize our schools, and they just ran them through every state legislature that they could take a hold of. And that's what happened in North Carolina starting in 2010. It deepened in 2012 when they got a supermajority in the governor. And what we started to see was not just a pay freeze, right? But then we saw laying off 8,000 teaching assistants, right? So every elementary school teacher's job just got twice as hard, right? And instead of doubling the number of adults that we have in buildings, we cut it, right? We also took away people's incentives for master's pay, right? So why would I invest my money if I'm going to only ever make less money going forward, right? So the number of people who wanted to get additional certifications, who wanted to grow as professionals, right, couldn't do that any longer, right? We've seen an increase in the testing regime during this period. And during that period, an increase of the pressure of the standardized test. So if I got to walk back into a building every day and there's a big scarlet letter F on that building, and when I walk around my community and I say, oh, I teach at such and such, and people give me a look because there's an F on my school because of standardized test scores, right? That doesn't make me feel valued. That doesn't make me want to go back there, right? There's not an investment in leadership in schools, right? So we don't have a good kind of process by which people can stay in the profession and become leaders, right? The only path to do that is to become school administrators. And Amanda, I feel certain that you have gotten nowhere near the training or the support that you need in order to be as successful as you could possibly be. And that's no diss on Wake County Public Schools, but it's just about how we invest in our school systems. And then on top of all that, just the working conditions are hard. right? Yeah, even in the best of times, in order to stay on top of the workloads with the number of kids you have and the number of, kind of assignments you need to create in order to make their experience meaningful, you can't work less than a 60-hour week. I was really, really, really good at this job for 11 years, Yvonne, and I never once in my life worked a week that was less than 60 hours, right? And that's just hard to sustain. And I made a choice in my life. I don't have my own children, right? I don't, like, this is what I wanted to do. But people who have their own kids, people who have, and you got to hold down a second job in order to survive, and you're not attending to your own family, and you're not attending to your health. You're not going for a run in the evening. You're not eating the healthy meal. All those things just add up. They all just add up. So, yeah, I think that's a lot of what's happened in the last 10, 15 years to exacerbate a problem that, like Amanda said, was already there, already kind of right on the edge.
And you even
So
missed
Amanda,
longevity pay and the removal of health insurance. I'm sure you probably never got longevity pay like I did, and then also how our veteran teachers are locked in without any chance for pay opportunities.
100%. Yeah, and I think that's really important, Amanda, to name the way that they have structured the pay scale, right? It makes it very clear that what they want is for people to come in for 5 years and then leave, right? Because all the pay increases are structured at the bottom of the profession, right? And I don't know about you, Amanda, I think it was my 5th year that I finally learned how to tie my shoes a little bit, and I was good at this thing, right? So people sticking in the profession is what allows you to be good. But if I'm paid exactly the same amount from year 15 through 25, and that's the time period when I'm trying to send a kid through college or something like that, I can't stay, right? It doesn't make any sense. Unless you know what their intention is, right? Which is to create a revolving door, right? Of people who are never actually able to meet our kids' needs sufficiently.
well, I want to come back to this in a second, Brian, but I want to, Amanda, I think Brian's set up a perfect question for you right now, which is, so all this is going on and you're sitting there as the principal, you have to hire people. So what's happening when you, in this atmosphere, what was happening 10 years ago when you were at Cary High and you're working to recruit folks, and now you're at Salem Middle 10 years later? What does it feel like out there? What does it look like? And what are you saying to folks?
Yeah, so I would say 10 years ago, the pool was huge, especially in Wake County. You didn't have to worry about, if you're an administrator, you post a job, you have 60 to 70 applicants, 30 of them are probably very good and you can't go wrong. You've got a huge pipeline of kids, student teachers coming into buildings. Every school is full of, at least 5 or 6 student teachers. And in the past 5 years, I'd say that has, I'm begging universities right now to get student teachers to try to hold them. And 10 years ago, NC State might have had 50 middle grades ELA social studies folks coming out. Now they're down to maybe 6. And so even though those 6 are mighty and strong, they still can't populate all of the buildings. And so it becomes such that you're making connections with universities that you didn't used to make. I'm on the phone constantly with like Appalachian, Elizabeth City State, schools in Pennsylvania, South Carolina, trying to recruit to here, which is a whole other part of the job that I don't think used to be there. I don't think it used to be this hard to find people, which takes away from instructional leadership and all of the other things you're supposed to be doing, because now we're just worried about having bodies in a building, and you're going out of your way to make those bodies quality bodies for kids. I also think we're having to get a little more savvy with alternative licensure, because you're not seeing students graduating from teacher ed programs. And so I bet that every principal is now really well versed. I mean, I've been at restaurants in downtown Raleigh, and I have a really outgoing waiter, and I'm like, hey, do you have a bachelor's degree, thinking I can get this person in front of children? And that never would have happened before, but now it's like, it's constantly recruiting. Like, I carry cards around, I'm like, hey, call me, you want to be a teacher? I think it's also starting earlier. So in Wake County, our transfer window opens February, and it is cutthroat right now. And one of the things I was talking about to our hiring processor about is how they're not seeing a lot of new hires. They're seeing a lot of movement right now, and hopefully there will be new hires. But, we're not looking good as far as filling positions for next school year right now. And I think one of the tiny glimmers of hope that I think is coming out of this is that as a principal, there is a lot more onus to create a culture in your building that is very supportive of teachers who are good, and you have to take care of your people, because if you don't, they will leave and they will go somewhere else. And I think that's one of my successes, is being able to, what can I take off a teacher's plate? It's all hands on deck. You know, it's a solid place to work. People feel supported here. But I also I started my teaching career at Garner High, and we had a lot of BTs and we had a lot of long timers. We didn't have people in the middle because they would leave. And so I feel for people and colleagues I have in other districts that are, you know, there's a middle school in a neighboring district. They haven't had a special ed teacher on staff all year, and folks from central office are coming out to run IEPs. And so, you know, in Wake County, if there's a shortage and we're the highest paying supplement, and we're unfortunately stealing from all of our neighbors, and Durham's doing the same because they're pretty competitive as well. But you're really, you know, every time I pull somebody from a more rural county or somebody who's moving out because they simply can't afford to live, you're really feeling for what the situation must be in other places if it's this dire in Wake County.
Amanda,
Can I jump in on, Can I jump in on that real quick? Just one thing, the story about like recruiting folks at a restaurant you're eating at, Amanda. Like I just want to say this aloud to folks so people can get a sense of this, right? Like, what we're talking about is the development of our future. Like we're talking about the brain development of young people, which is a thing that's not just like something that anyone can do. Right? Like, this is a precious and sacred and difficult task that we're talking about, right? And imagine like Amanda like was going out and like going into restaurants and being like, you're pretty outgoing. Like, can we get you into medical school maybe? You know, and just this notion that like something as sacred and important of that kind of task is like, this is what we're leaving the recruitment of people to do, right? And that it's disgusting. It's really, really, really awful. And we wouldn't approach any other task of that level of import in that way. Right.
And the thing I'll add to that too is the demand for quality teachers with parents has not decreased, and it won't decrease. And so you're not giving public schools the ability to go out and hire the best and the brightest because they're simply not there. They're not coming out of our universities. People aren't going to move here from out of state for 40th best teacher pay in the nation. And so you're really, you know, you've got this competing interest with parents and families and community stakeholders wanting the best of the best, but not willing to support and pay for the best of the best.
Well, I mean, what's interesting, right, is that it actually feels like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because it's like the thing is choking us out, right? And making it be so that parents are not having a good experience. And then parents are like, we need an alternative to the school. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy by the people who want to privatize our schools, is to say, like, let's cut the resources to make the public school experience as bad as we can possibly make it. Then let's publicly, with all the resources that we have, talk about how bad that experience is and create space for people to say that. And then be like, we've got this magical option of charters and private schools. Y'all take these things, right? So it's a setup from the start. And I think that, to me, is, Yvonne, the thing that feels like important to kind of name, right? Is there's a way sometimes we think about this where we talk about the people in charge of this being confused, or sort of like they need to walk a day in a teacher's shoes, or like they just don't understand the impact of what it is. They do understand the impact of what they're doing. There's powerful forces in this country that are trying to commodify education as like the last part of the economy that you can't pull a lot of profit out of. And so that's what the charter movement is about. That's what the privatization movement is about. It's about how do you get profits out of really the only sector of our economy that you can't pull profits from anymore, right? And so they got to find that one last part. And so if they choke us out, make us look bad, put an F on all our schools, give parents terrible experiences, and then say, we've got this option, but you can't track the option because it's not a public system, right? Then, you know, the thing just devolves into chaos, right? And a chaos in which parents who have resources can get their kids what they need, and everybody else is left out in the cold.
And that is really the most painful sentence you've said right there. When you think about, so we are intentionally creating have and have not schools. We're intentionally creating have and have not school systems. And so a system where if you have the finances and the ability, you can buy your way out of, you can transfer it out of, and the children who are unable to do that are left behind. And under-resourced source schools with perhaps not the top shelf personnel to provide the services there. And to no fault of their own, right? Thank goodness for those folks. And Bryan, one of the things I think is really important is this whole concept of messaging, right? Because Bryan's really hit it on the nail on the head for me. I mean, they have stolen the message, right? They've taken this message that our schools are failing, and even after they created it, right? And we saw, Bryan, we saw them delete the end, totally wipe out, stop the Teaching Fellows Program. And then they recreated a new version in their own name that was, as Lynn pointed out, not anywhere funded as well, not dispersed across the state and all our universities, and with little money.
We call it Teaching Fellows Light.
Yeah.
But Yvonne, remember, prior to that, when they first eliminated the program, they actually then put funding into Teach for America.
Oh yes, thank you.
Right, which is for people who are kind of being well-meaning and kind of manipulated in a way. Like it poses as a solution to a problem, but it's essentially a temp service that says that the only thing you need to be an educator is to be smart, right? And so we can go to the colleges and we can recruit any person that we say is smart and give them 3 weeks of training, and they're going to be doing the most important and most difficult job on the planet with our most precious humans in the most precious state that they're in, right? So actually taking a program that we know works, right? And one-to-one substituting the funding for a temporary teacher agency that was created by privatizers.
And amazing, Amanda, that was kind of like short-circuiting your idea, right? They were getting them before they got to the restaurant. They were getting it right out of college before they got to the restaurant and learned how to even get along with people. And so that's true. And Bryan, that's a very important point. And one of the things I do want folks to do, I put a link in the chat to the timeline that we have on our website that is really encourage you to look at, because it's documenting what Amanda and Bryan are saying. In 2011, they did this. In 2013, they cut teacher assistants. In 2013, they cut out the teaching fellows, and they cut out longevity, they cut out master's pay. And so honestly, the question I have now is, what are we going to do, and what can we help our audience understand what to do, and our public understand how we can disrupt this self-fulfilling prophecy? Because honestly, if we could ever have one-on-one conversations with the world, right? When people start to understand what Bryan was talking about, and what you're talking about, Amanda, they quickly see that this is a bad policy, a bad politics, bad for our economy. In fact, I don't know how they're not, people in the legislature aren't embarrassed to invite Apple to come to our state. That a company that wants to have, pay high salaries, offer good benefits to a state where we don't really have, we're not producing the workforce they need. Right, and a place that we're not recognizing our teachers to have good benefits and good pay. Isn't this ironic? I mean, how can we change this message?
Yeah, they're continuing, it's kind of like what Bryan talked about at the beginning. They're continuing to ask more and to flex and pivot and do less and less. And Apple came because the schools are still really good here because of the people who are in them. And they're not being supported. And I'm not sure how much longer that can last. And so, just to recap some of the things we talked about that I feel like are important going forward are funding teaching fellows. I was a teaching fellow at NC State. It's magic to see 400 teachers that people are battling for all over the state who are coming from rural counties and want to go back home. You're not getting that anymore. Now they're leaving and they're not going back home. So I feel like when I was at State, a lot of people were invested in the district that they came from, which I think is very powerful. Also diversifying the teacher pipeline by putting those at HBCUs and probably funding those more. And then continuing to advocate. It's getting serious when, some of the slides that Lynn showed before, especially in the Triangle now in some of the urban areas, you can't afford to live here anymore. And it's even there's a discussion starting now in towns where my middle school is like Apex, where the town is looking at different levels of housing to ensure that not just teachers, but police and firefighters can even afford to live in those areas. And so teacher salaries have got to be competitive for that. And then I think, something that everybody can do is use their tools that they have, word of mouth, social media, to really celebrate what is happening and change the rhetoric around public schools, because we still have most of the market share. One of the things I work on a lot is stealing my market share back from charters, because it opens and it's shiny and new, but the package isn't as good as what it's advertised as. So we're constantly pulling them back. And then, whenever we do bring them back, I encourage parents, please tell everybody that the experience was not what you were initially sold and that you're getting quality education here.
Very good. Lynn, did you want to, you had a question, Lynn?
Yeah, I have a comment, and then I want Amanda and Bryan to comment on this. So my comment is to tell the audience, or remind the audience, I am so sorry, my dogs are coming in. To remind the audience that North Carolina's A through F school letter grades has the absolute worst formula of all the states that use them, and we shouldn't be using them to start with, but of all the states that use them, we have the worst formula in the nation, with a 20% growth rate and 80% test score. So it is largely based on a moment in time of that test score, and growth is not reflected. There have been bipartisan efforts to improve that formula, and they have all failed. And it shames students and teachers, and it does not give parents a fair picture, a real picture of what's happening in the school building. And they're an absolute privatization tool. So just know that about those, F schools that Bryan was mentioning, that, teachers have to walk around with that around their necks, and administrators too, Amanda. My question for you both is, how do you feel about this idea, this notion that we can take folks in the corporate industry that might be an expert in a particular field and fast track them into a classroom? What comes to my mind and concern is, teaching is a skill, and it is a skill that is, hard earned. And just because you might be an expert on a topic doesn't mean that you have the ability to teach it. So can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier. 10 or 15 years ago, you're looking at resumes, you're not touching anybody that hasn't gone through a teacher training program, because the level of support, even if you find the right magical unicorn that has what it takes to make it in the classroom and cares about kids, because that's what you're looking at. And it gets a little worse as you hit the secondary level, because you're looking for kids over content. So you take these people who are passionate about content but don't have the skills for the kids. And then you need so many people in your building, which I also just want to say that really drains the other teachers that you have and the administrators, because you have to pour into those people so much. And we're having to do that now. And that's what we're doing to make it work, but it's not ideal, because those people either need to go through, a training program at a university or some kind of schooling. That should not be falling on the backs of colleagues who are supporting those folks with all of the things they missed in a teacher training program, or administrators. But at this point, that's becoming one of the only, it's a Band-Aid right now to fix it. So, and Bryan, you can definitely add to that, I'm sure.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, watching Scrubs don't make you a doctor. I mean, I think there's a thing that's about the deprofessionalization of the craft, right? And there is something about a disrespect of the craft that goes back to the sexism that I was talking about before. Like when Phil Berger is talking about TAs are obsolete, like typewriters, right? And essentially the conversation publicly during COVID has become about like, we're babysitters essentially, right? Like there is a thing about the deprofessionalization of care work, right? That like, y'all, it's hard. Like the challenges that, Amanda and I could probably spend the rest of the night going back and forth, naming like moments in a classroom where there was a thing that at 2 years we couldn't do it, but at 10 we could, right? Or because we'd had access to this kind of training, we couldn't do a thing. But then when we had access to that kind of training and support, we could. So I think, one, I think there's just a notion that, again, I think is sexist and unacceptable, that is the deprofessionalization of the career in general, right? But I think there's also a thing that I don't think the model that we have set up, even the standards we want people to meet, I don't think that's sufficient. We actually need to be, the bulk of learning that people do is on the job. Right. And so we actually need to build in mentoring programs. We need to build in more time for reflection by practitioners. We need to build in more time for practitioners to be able to watch each other and give each other feedback. So there's whole systems. And there's lots of people around the country that are starting to think about this. So I want to go back to the thing I said before about Teach for America. Like, I'm not dissing anybody who takes a sort of an alternative path to education. I didn't do an undergrad education degree. I went back and got certified, but I came back at, and I think there's lots of people who are really talented people who can step in and can do the work. And I think we do need to have some flexibility around that. But I think the better way to do that is actually to build more robust support structures once people are in the game, actually. And I think we can be doing a better job. I mean, the retention rate for people who go through a university teacher training program is abysmal, right? So we already should have learned the lessons of we need to have more kind of structured supports for people when they step in, because, and Amanda, I'm sure you're not this principal, right? But there are principals who are like, okay, we got this little rookie who's fresh out the box, and we have to have class sizes of 35 with some of these groups, and they're all freshmen. So like, the veterans don't want to take that 35-person freshman class, so we'll give it to the rookie. And we kind of all just hope that rookie can make it through 2 or 3 years, in which case then we'll give them a better assignment. And then, but like that we burn through folks in this way, in a way that, like, again, looking at something like the profession of medicine, right? People get a 4 or 5 year residency, right? In which they are learning how to do this sacred craft, right? Why do we treat this any differently?
And, I've been taking notes here, and I've kind of been put in the chat there, Amanda and Bryan, what I'm hearing you're saying: professional level salaries, job security, stability, teaching as a profession and treating people as professionals in their craft, ongoing staff development, a career path, a way to evaluate teachers that are fairly, having those things in the classroom, the helping professionals, school nurses, school social workers, psychologists, teacher assistants. All of this, when you think about it, doesn't it seem like just common sense of making any profession important? I work in a research position, and when I'm going to hire people, of course, I want them to have the resources they need to be successful. I want them to have all those things in the classroom to be successful. I mean, their classroom is their office. What do they need? They need a computer. They need, books. They need research materials. They need some training, as Bryan said, ongoing training, and they need support around them, people to answer questions and mentor them, so that they can become really good at their job. And I don't know that there's any CEO in any company or any manager of any business that wouldn't want all the things I've listed in this chat here that y'all have been saying for their employees. And in fact, a figure I'd like to bring your attention to, a recent study looked at college graduates in all their fields, just undergraduate degree, and that leaving college and earning and entering the marketplace, that education majors, teachers, off the bat made 20% less right off the bat. So how, to me, that's like a beginning place to start, that we have to fix some of the pipeline issues, right? If you're a college recruiter and you're looking at picking your major, your parents talking to your children, Amanda, you're talking to your students, Bryan, you've had thousands of high school kids come through and you see, this is what their parents are seeing too, right? This research data is all over the internet, that you're going to make at least 20 and maybe greater in rural areas, 30% less when you come out of college, and you have no support system for teaching fellows, no grants. So it seems like I just want to call that out, because I don't know if you have some comments you want to make about that, but to me, that's shameful that we've set up a structure of beginning pay is 20% less than majoring in communication, getting a bachelor's in art, getting a bachelor's in social work. I mean, all of these fields, you come in as a teacher 20 to 30% less.
I think that goes back to a thing that Amanda said earlier, that is, to me, as someone who is desperately trying all day, every day to keep people in the profession, one of the things that's like really the worst thing I ever hear in my entire life is when an educator tells their kids that they should not become an educator. It's the worst. It is literally the worst, because what it means, right, is this thing that we've wanted to do our whole lives, that is like the most rewarding thing a human being can do. It means it's like drained, like our joy has been drained in that, right? And we no longer look at that sacred task as a sacred task, right? And so I think that, in addition to the things that you said about like kind of the fellows program starting people off at a higher rate, I actually think, and this is a conversation, that's starting to emerge in some places, I think school districts could build partnerships with universities and kind of build your own sort of programs, and again, I think all this stuff requires resources from somewhere, and I think the state should be responsible for those. But thinking about Durham Public Schools, for example, and saying, what would happen if we did if we just, in every elementary school and middle school, we just talked all day about how dope it is to be a teacher. Just like posters in the hallway about the teacher superstars, and here's the custodian that saves, this, resource for us instead of wasting it. And, here's the counselor who does these. And we just all the time, like in our school system, we're just holding up our professionals as heroes, right? So that by the time kids get to 7th and 8th grade, we've got a magnet program, right? Like somewhere in the district that's like a mini teaching fellows, right? And kids come into that, and they take, regular classes, right? But they also do like summer internships, like NCAE, we have a teacher cadet curriculum, right? So people could do summer internships, et cetera, right? Like imagine if in Durham, we recruited some significant percentage of Black and Latino kids into a program like that, gave them bilingual training, right, when they're in high school, like Spanish immersion, right? So that what we are doing is churning out these kids who have, done summer internships, who have had practice, who have been tutoring, been mentoring, been working with young people, right? So they're solid. They know this is the thing they want to do. And then we've got a partnership with North Carolina Central. We've got a partnership with Duke that says you go through all the way as long as you want, and then you owe Durham Public Schools 5 years. If we do that, right, like we're investing in Black and brown kids who are bilingual coming out of DPS, no debt, going back into their own schools that they deeply love in their own communities, right? And what's the likelihood that those kids are going to be able to stay, right? And then we build more robust supports around them once they step into the profession. We just solved the problem right there, right?
That's very exciting. That's very exciting.
But somebody's got to put some resources behind it, right? And again, the thing is, like I hear, I think what you're saying, Yvonne, is super important. I think it's important for us to not concede the notion that it should be common sense to do these things. But I just want to not let us ever get confused that these folks aren't confused. Their common sense is profit. Their common sense is division, right? And, thinking about the ways in which racism gets used to do this, right? So coming out of the pandemic, there is not a more important institution in this country, except for maybe public health, right, than public schools. We literally saved the country right, in the midst of this economy. And so what should have been happening in the last year is every school board, county commission, state legislature, and the US Congress should have just been going like this with money just all day long. Y'all saved us. Thank you. Let's get you through it, right? And they know that there's a real potential for that in a moment like that, because people really finally understood how central public schools are to the existence of anything in our society, right? So in a moment when we've got that kind of potential, what does the other side do? They make up this thing about critical race theory, and they go to parents and they say, your kids are being indoctrinated. Someone is trying to steal something from you. Someone's trying to steal something from you. Someone's trying to steal, and they just get everybody all activated and get their amygdalas all seized up. And they start going out and yelling at school systems that are serving their kids every day in a way that is going to weaken that school system and not get their kids' need met, right? So they use racism in that instance to divide us in a moment when there's actually a ton of potential to put more resources in our schools, right? So again, all this stuff, not to be sort of conspiracy theorist about it, but like it would actually have to be hidden to be a conspiracy theory. And this stuff is not hidden. It's very clear. And so I think we just need to keep saying out loud, nobody's confused. Nobody needs to walk a day in a teacher's shoes. They know exactly what they're doing. They know why they're doing it. And the only thing that we can do to stop them is to build more power than they have. I
agree. And one of the things that, well, Bryan, first of all, I have to stop for just a second and say that I'm excited and inspired with some of your suggestions of what we can do locally, because I haven't heard anything as well put and as well described and as well thought out as what you've just said. I hope a lot of people hear what you said tonight and go back to their school boards and their county commissioners and start thinking about this. I know that Wake County and a few other places are trying really hard to do their grow your own, and it's going to even be more critical to do in urban areas where you can't afford to live anymore. And in rural areas where there just isn't enough labor force or local tax base. So this model to me works in both places for different reasons. And it's really exciting. But Amanda, I wanted to say to everybody in our audience, if you have a question, get ready. I want to call on you right now. So, turn on your camera, raise your hand, put it in the chat, because I want you to have a chance before we sign off tonight to ask Amanda and Bryan any questions you want. You've got a principal that's on the firing line every day trying to make this work in her school, and you've got a leader of the teachers union that's trying remarkably to work across the state and keep professionals in the classroom and bring more in. So put your questions in the chat or raise your hand, and Lynn's keeping an eye out, and we'll make sure we don't overlook you. But Amanda, did you want to add anything to what Bryan had said?
Yeah, I just I'll add something of what you just said about, coming into the profession, knowing that you're making 20% less than other folks with bachelor's degrees. So I'm a first generation college graduate. As a high school teacher, that was something I was really passionate about, is getting kids into college, hopefully to be teachers. And I just want to say that for a lot of the folks, the kids that we're looking at, especially Black and brown kids and other kids who are first generation college folks, it's really even more difficult now to say you're going to be the first one in your family to go to college. And we know that you've made this huge accomplishment and you're going to start out making 20% less than any other person, and you're not getting the same level of respect. So, there's so many things, and I will give a shout out to Wake County because we are doing the future teacher program. Now that Bryan just spoke about like an early college, I'm like, whoa, we need to make it so much better, because I do feel like it only gets promoted for a few weeks a year when the application period is on. But I've been a speaker at those programs, and it's pretty awesome to see, 40 or 50 kids that out of senior high school are offered a teaching contract as long as they finish their requirements and they're getting that in-service training. But again, that can't fall on the county commissioners and the school systems who are already strapped for money. It has to come from the legislature.
I want to come to this thing that Sam just threw in the chat, Yvonne, because it was the thing I was going to name when Amanda was talking. So when I went to state, I think that the undergrad tuition for the year between 1997 and 2001 was I think about $2,000, maybe 25, right? In the early 90s, it had been $1,000, right? By the time I went back to grad school in 2002, the undergrad tuition was already like 6 or 7. Anybody know? Could you put it in the chat right now? Anybody know what undergrad tuition at North Carolina State is right now?
2,700 a semester.
2,700 semester, right? So we've gone from 1,000, right, in the early 90s, and it's now 5 times as much, right? And what we know about the economy of the United States in the last 40 years is that the only thing that has happened is wealth has been accumulated towards the top, and the overwhelming majority of us, our wages, our wealth, our everything has gone significantly down. So in the same time period that college expenses have gone up by over 5 times, our wages and our ability to spend money has gone down, right? And then we're asking those folks who are now saddled with all that debt to come into a profession where you are never going to make more than $55,000 a year. Why would you do it? Why would you do it? Unless you are someone, who is just deeply committed to kids. And again, that's what these folks are counting on, is like the ability to just like have some of us who deeply care about kids in the future go in and just ride us as long as they can until we drop dead, and then put somebody else in behind us to just sort of barely get the needs met.
Yeah, and going to what Sam said, when I was a teaching fellow, 01 to 05, the teaching fellows package then was about $27,000. It almost covered things, probably 40,000 then. And now, if you're looking at fees and expenses with rent that have gone up so much, you are looking at double in some cases for that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the parents told me yesterday that when you take the tuition at state and you add room and board and books and fees and fines, those kind of things, that they are spending $10,000 a semester. Now, maybe you could be like me and eat a lot of noodles and beanie weenies and keep it down to 8, but we're still talking about $8,000 a semester. And at NC State now, it costs almost $2,000 to take a graduate course, Bryan. So even if you get the undergraduate down, so this is a tremendous cost now to get education. But I think that what Lynn, I don't want to miss any questions or anything that you've seen in the chat, because I'm not very good at looking at chat.
I have not seen any, and I don't see any raised hands, and all that's fine. You guys can follow up with us later.
Okay. Go ahead, Bryan.
Yeah, there's something that Lynn put in the chat that I think is important, right? Because the thing that I named, right? So again, let's follow the trajectory of our state, where in the early 90s, you could go to college at state for $1,000 for the year, right? Now you just named $10,000 for a semester, right? While our wages have gone down, right? While the state has consistently cut taxes for the people at the top to limit the amount of revenue that comes in, and are sitting on billions of dollars of revenue as our schools crumble, right? So again, y'all, we have to look at, there is a very intentional thing happening. And at the core of it is a philosophy that the role of government is to move more money into the hands of wealthy people, and that's it. Right? And there's those of us that think that the role of government is to provide for the needs of our folks, right? And that's the competition that we're in at the state level right now, is that there are some people who think that the role of state government is to facilitate wealthy people getting wealthier. And the rest of us think that the role of the state government is to meet our needs. And we look at a constitution, right, that has in it a commitment to public education, one of the few constitutions in the country that has that. And we know that that commitment comes from 1868. This is a Reconstruction constitutional commitment. This is the first demand that newly freed Black people made throughout the South. So when we're talking about the public's, like the existential crisis and threat to public schools, we're talking about the elimination of an institution that newly freed people demanded and won in our state on the back of ending slavery. And now that institution is under threat because we want to give rich people more of their money back.
And Bryan, to add to what you said and what Lynn's pointed to, is that we already had the corporate tax rate was 2.5%, the lowest in the nation. And that is being totally eliminated over the next few years. The next bit of business they're about right now is, and they have been for 10 years, is lowering the individual tax rate. And it's their goal is to eliminate it. And so we would then be a state that it runs on sales tax and fines and fees, which are all regressive taxes on those who are least able to pay, where you're paying, and so that is exactly proof, Bryan, to your point. The proof is right there in the General Assembly and the statutes that they've passed the last 10 years. Cut every single year. They've cut the tax rates for the individuals and for corporations. And now we are going to have a state that is run totally, very much like Florida, on the backs of those who are least able to pay. And the wealthy folks who don't mind too much of paying a fee to rent the golf cart or a fee to use the boat dock, where people who are living on the edge or have poverty wages or working low income jobs cannot, they feel the same impact of those taxes. So, okay. So we see a situation that
Yvonne, real quick, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mary Kolick asked a question, two questions, and I know Bryan's watching the chat real closely. If you or Amanda want to take those, she's asking about, how do we mobilize teachers to vote for their own interest, and then also if you've had success moving members of the public to understand and take action.
Yeah, so on the question of teachers voting, I mean, there's actually a strange misconception about this. Teachers actually vote at a very high percentage. And we actually vote largely for politicians who will support our interests, right? So there's a little bit of a misnomer around that, right? And in some ways, that story actually functions to put the blame back on teachers and other educators, which isn't super helpful. But I think the reality that you're speaking to, Mary, is actually why some of us are doing this work. Because if you look at public schools in this state, in 97 out of 100 counties, the public schools are the number 1, 2, or 3 employer in the county. So if you were able to organize every educator, right, and every parent, right, whose interests overlap, right? Because what we're all concerned about is the futures of our kids. If we could get on the same page, there isn't a single school board, county commission, state legislative seat, US Congress seat that we couldn't immediately, right, like reshape tomorrow if we had an alliance built, a voting block built between educators and parents. And so that's literally like what we're trying to do at NCAE is figure out how to organize our school communities and our communities to build that block, because we think that is the block that can produce a future for our state. So if we have parents and educators, that's the two groups of people who are thinking about the future all day long and investing in the future all day long. And if we have political power in that unity, right, then we can make a future for our kids that is real. I mean, the other thing that we need to name in the midst of all this, y'all, is that like there's a climate crisis clock that is ticking. So like there, in addition to like the need that we need to save our schools, like this vision of society that the folks at the top of our state are putting forward is a vision that is bad for all forms of life, And so the reality is like, Mary, that work is the work that has to be done. And that work is just painstakingly slow and hard. And you just one conversation after one conversation, one door knock after one door knock. And that's what we're trying to figure out how to do. But it's a resource of intensive, work. And it's challenging work. And there is a whole power structure that is built, right? Like right now, for example, just there, like parents and educators are natural allies, right? But they are right now there are so many pressures being put on those relationships that it's making it really hard for those people to see themselves as the same set of folks with the same self-interests. Right. And so it is hard for us to overcome all these stories that we see in the press every day that divide us from our parents. Right. And we actually need to do, and a lot of those stories, rely on racism. But there's a lot that we have to do to repair that work. And I think the most important thing that educators can be doing is building, one-on-one, building relationships with parents. The best thing that parents can be doing is showing up, building relationships in the schools, and saying, like, how do we show up for each other? How do we fight for the things that all of us need and deserve?
That beautifully said, Bryan. Amanda, you're nodding your head. I want to give you a chance to respond to that question too, if you have something.
Yeah, I would just add, a lot of what Bryan said, and we've got to remove the distractors. And so I think a lot of people are planning these huge distractors that are creating that divide, especially between that parent and educator block. And I'm in an area right now that doesn't want to hear about restorative justice, CRT. And that's a very small, really vocal minority. And so you have to be willing to reach out. And so whenever I get a phone call or an email, it is, come in and talk to me about it. What exactly are you concerned about? Come see what we're doing. Come see the materials that we're using. Come see how these teachers love on your kid every single day. And it takes that right out of it. It takes the wind out. But there's so much commotion about things and people are not educated about it, that we've got to be really good diplomatic ambassadors about it to bring people to our side, because there's really not the war between parents and educators is an imaginary war with a few vocal folks. And I feel like those are the people that we also have to protect our teachers from, because they're beating them down right now, and it's not the story. It's not the big story.
Amanda, you sound like the principal, doesn't she, Bryan, that every teacher wants?
I was just gonna say, man, it's so stupid. It's so stupid, Amanda, that you have to spend your time doing that.
Yep.
Right? And again, that is something that was created by the people who want to destroy public schools. Like literally an hour that you are wasting of your day, that you are not getting to support educators who are in the room supporting those parents' kids, because you are having this hour-long conversation that was forced upon you by someone who lives in Ohio somewhere, who wants to destroy public schools now, and they're saying that they care about the outcomes for kids, but you, the professional, had to spend an hour on this stupid nonsense rather than giving your teachers and other staff the support that they need and deserve, right? So like we can just see one-to-one how this political movement created by wealthy people who want to destroy public schools just took away an hour of what our kids needed in that school. That's one example. And I'm sure Amanda can count the number of hours that she has lost, that has been forced upon her, right? It's kind of like, Phil Berger just came to the building and just held Amanda outside for an hour.
I'd invite him in, Bryan. Just coming on in.
Man.
I think that's another big thing too that we try to do at our school, is invite as many people in as possible. As many of especially, I think parents are now starting to rally more around, you're seeing increased turnout at school board elections. So rallying, and there you see the fruits of your vote. And we've got to make sure that everybody knows that their vote does matter, especially when it's pulled together.
Well, I really think that, Amanda, I'm really applaud you, because I think what you're doing, Bryan's right, you're being robbed of your focus and your time. At the same time, you are removing the distractors. You are responding back in a way that's effective. And I think sometimes that's kind of part of our challenge, is how to effectively message back and fight back against this narrative that we know is silly and false and wrong. And against and often a narrative that is full of lies, just to be blunt.
But the solution is the connection, right? So like what Amanda is like demonstrating, right, is like part of how this story gets told is because we're isolated and split from each other, right? And if we can have a conversation, right, all these parents that are being sort of riled up and pushed out, like they just want what's good for their kids, right, in the same way that we do too, and if we can have conversations directly with each other, right, without these privatizer interests trying to shape the conversation, then it's a very different conversation.
And one of the things that I would say, I'll just add a personal comment of an article I just read a few days ago that was really very concerned about the success that the privatizers have had at pulling away kids out of our public school system, and really pointing out to what end. So you go to a charter school that's staffed with uncertified teachers and teachers who weren't qualified and aren't effective. The kids are not getting the education they need. In a private schools in North Carolina, some of them have 20% of their teaching force they don't even have a college degree. They're not required to even have a college degree. You can't even get them at a restaurant, Amanda. You can't even pick them up because they don't even have to have that. So we're to what end? And their success is creating a system that is going to bottom out, because it is going to fail all of society, all of those parents, all of those kids, and our economy and our future labor force, because they can pull these kids out of the system and help collapse the public school system, but they're pulling them into a situation, into a boat with a hole in the bottom that can't be sustained. And I think it is our duty to educate the public and to fight back against a false narrative, but also a danger that is lurking in our society and in our schools and in our community. The challenge I think we have, Bryan, in connecting our parents and educators, your thoughts, yours and Amanda's, about better ways we can do that. Because that has always been, when we look at the PTA, Parent Teacher Association, we look to every school that sometimes is doing a great job and supporting its kids. It's because it has a great PTA, right, or PTO. So how do we, give us your thoughts? You're in the classroom, you're on the front line. Some other ways that Lynn and I can promote through our organization, ways to build this collaboration back.
I would just start with, we have not, the connections have been broken during pandemic because parents haven't been in the building, kids haven't been in the building. And so now the time is right to make all of that happen again and invite people in to see the magic. The time is right to do what Bryan was talking about earlier, be a champion for teachers. And that can start in buildings with kids and with adults. But I think we've really just got to change the rhetoric. We've got to celebrate the things that are happening here. Teachers are superheroes. They've been doing insurmountable tasks with grace for the past few years and before that, but the past few years have been especially difficult, and that has to be celebrated and it has to be appreciated. And hopefully that rhetoric will lead to increased support with the legislature.
Okay, Bryan?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of different things. I think one, I think just kind of building around like what Amanda just said, like I think, each one of us has a thing we can do, right? Like individual people can, parents can be in the buildings more, educators can, make a commitment to do more communicating and more, effective connecting with parents, right? So those things I think are real. And I think there's lots of things that schools can do to make that happen, right? Again, I think part of the thing that is challenging about this moment, right, is like there's this notion that's been beat into public school folks, right, that again, I think is related to sexism, that's sort of like you can't be political, right? Like if you speak out about things on your job, then you're like being political, and public schools aren't political and this kind of thing, right? Like we need to reject that notion, right? And a principal like Amanda, right, like seeing the big picture, like I don't want a principal like Amanda being like, I'm going to host a forum for this one candidate that I'm trying to support. That's not what I'm talking about. But Amanda can look at the big picture thing that the movement to destroy public schools is doing, which is trying to divide parents and educators from each other, and can use school resources, programming, etc., to counter that. Right. So we can be thinking about how do we use the resources of our institutions to combat that, one. I think a second thing, and this is a thing that's like, it really, really is a bummer to have to say this out loud, right? That I think the main way that this is going to change is that the people who are doing the 50 to 60 hour a week job are going to have to just organize ourselves better and push harder. And one of the things that's been really, really difficult to like have conversations with people about recently is asking people as educators, what is it they're doing between hours 60 and 65, right? and thinking about what level of effectiveness those hours have for their kids. And what if instead of hours 60 to 65, making one last, tweak to a lesson plan, or one, like whatever, right? Being like, go talk to your coworkers, right? And talk to your coworkers about what it is we can be doing to make our situation better, right? Make calls to parents and make sure they understand what's happening and ask them to get in the building and be supportive. There's a lot of things that educators do past our 40-hour week, right, that are about meeting the needs of our kids, right? The problem is most of them cannot actually meet the needs of our kids, except for in tiny, minuscule, individualist ways, when instead, if we use those 5 hours, for example, towards this effort, towards this fight, towards building organization, we could do way more good for our kids if we were able to build the kind of political power that that would produce. Right. So I would not advocate that if I thought that those hours of 60 to 65 were meeting critical needs that our kids had. I actually just don't think that that's true. I think that is the band-aidist of the band-aid territory that we're living in. And I think our time is better spent, right? Like talking to each other and talking to parents and engaging in a fight for our lives and for the lives of our communities and our schools. Because I think that's what the stakes are.
And Bryan, would you, one of the things that I wonder if you would add to that is having more direct interaction with businesses and business owners. Because right now we've been letting the Chamber of Commerce, we've been letting legislators, we've been letting a lot of people in our society interact with business. But, I have wondered about having more direct impact. When you hear Apple's coming, let's go meet with them. Let's have a group of teachers go meet with Apple or with, Biogen or all these different companies I see that are coming here. What if we had a coalition of parents and teachers go talk to these companies when they come, not about tax rates. That's what the chamber wants to do. But I throw that out there as something that I'm really thinking about. Why does just the Chamber of Commerce and just the legislature get to talk to these new businesses? How can we worm our way into those conversations?
Well, and I think this is, to go back to the thing I named before about the power of racism to divide people, right? Like what you're saying, Yvonne, is correct. Like the overwhelming majority of us all want public schools to be really good. And it helps like almost all of us, our lives get better if we've got really good quality public schools. So right. That's the coalition, right? That's the conversation we need to be having. And what the folks who want to privatize the schools are doing is just all their job is to do is all they have to do is divide us from each other. And we need to have a conversation that's about what is good for our kids, because you can take Republican and Democrat off of that, right? And you can lay out a program that what is good for the future of our kids. And it's not a partisan program. It's a program that the overwhelming majority of people in the state can get behind very, very, very easily.
Maybe we should start, Amanda and Bryan, start a program offering a free training program to all business executives on how to be effective advocate for your public school system, and actually challenge business leaders to take our course to educate themselves on the ways they can strengthen and support public schools, and chide them when they don't, right? Because that's what we see the model of the business community. Have you checked off these lists? Did you go to HR and take a diversity class? Did you take an IT class? At my university, I have to take something on cybersecurity all the time. I want somebody to force me to take a class on understanding the value of a strong public education system and how a business can support that, how they can be supporters. Anyway, so we're going to wrap up now because we've had a really great time, and I want to make sure one last time call to our audience, because I always hate it if someone feels like they attended with their precious time and didn't get a question answered. So one last shot on that.
We do have one more, and we got to make it quick because we've only got 10. We want to respect everybody's time, and I think ending at 8:30 is appropriate. So very quickly, someone wants to know, with so much burden at the state level and responsibility at the state level, what can local school boards and local districts do to improve this situation? And I know we talked about the Grow Your Own program, but what else would you add to that?
Bryan or Amanda?
I would definitely start with, I think as a school board member, those folks are huge, build huge alliances and networks to talk about budget with county commissioners. And I think it just goes up from there. And so I think the better, and also what Yvonne said, connecting with businesses. The reason those big businesses come here is because the schools are so good. So they're ready for that conversation. As a school leader, I've never reached out to a business in my community and had them shut the door in my face. They're always ready and willing to come in, do whatever they can to help kids, whether that's with materials, money, or time. And so, I think what we've said, kind of just synthesizing that to say that we're going to build these connections, we're going to do it in our community, we're going to get folks who hold the power in our community to broach those conversations with the legislature and organize that voting block is a good starting place.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bully pulpit is really important, right? Like, I think being able to talk about what is happening and help people understand what is happening, right? And that it's a two-sided thing that is happening. I think one, we need to be putting, and people on school boards have the ability to direct school systems to do things with their resources, right? Like, I think every school system needs to be having like really effective, well-trained communications machines that are all day long just pumping out the stories about all the amazing and incredible things that are happening in our school every single day. When I left the classroom, Yvonne, and I became the president of the Durham Association of Educators, the first thing I did was I went to every school and I wrote a blog post about all the great things that are happening in the schools. Those blog posts still get used by those schools to tell the story about why people should come to that school. This is 6-7 years later that's happening, right? Just because no one is doing it. So school systems, right? Again, school systems in this effort to stay out of a partisan fight that they think they're going to be punished for. First, they're being punished constantly, and they're not entering into the fight. But I understand why people in a public institution, ethically, morally, or whatever, don't take positions on this candidate versus this candidate or whatever. But you can still be in the fight, right? In a good communication system that is telling the story of all the great things that is happening in public schools every day, that contributes to the fight. Right? Having using the space in your county, in your work with the county commission, using your space in board meetings to talk honestly about what is happening with the resources that are going to you, the resources that are not going to you, and what the impact of that on your kids is, right? We just what's happening all the time is you got educators who are like either quitting or trying to stand up against this. And we have all these people, right, who are aligned with us, right? Like, because they should be, right? Principals, and Amanda is obviously very clearly an exception, but lots of principals won't, right? Principals, school board members, superintendents, county commissioners, all people that have the same interests as educators, but we go as educators and we're the ones who are working the 50 or 60-hour week. And then we're speaking out on top of that. And we don't have anybody who's invested in the same system speaking out along with us, right? So we need school board members to go into the state school board association and organize the school board association to get in the game in a different way, right? So we had a really important conversation with Alicia Garza, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, maybe 5-10 years ago, but shortly after things started. And Alicia was like, start everywhere. Basically it's just like, just wherever you are, there is a thing that you can do to affirm the mattering of Black lives, right? Wherever you are, you can be exploring what the possibilities are for you to be in this fight.
And, I do think I want to add to what you're saying about the local, how can the local things matter? Also, let's be honest, people care about their school. So if you're going to your school board, you're talking about your school. If you're going to the county commissioners, you're talking about your school needs this, your school needs a new heat pump, a new ceiling, new roofs. It really matters, and they have to listen because you elect them locally. But also General Assembly members listen to their local partners or colleagues better sometimes than to us. When county commissioners lobby themselves at General Assembly, it tends to actually have more impact. So, you start with school boards, start with commissioners, start with the parent groups, and you don't stop. So one of the things that, Bryan, I think at the very beginning, I'm going to take us right back for kind of a summary, is that, if we believe that public education is a public good, that it is something that is of value for all of the public, and that it's worth protecting, then, you know, I want to keep us focused on that, and not focused on allowing the narrative to be that our schools are failing. We know they're not. I think what we need to do instead is to be very angry over the condition that we're in with funding and with the pipeline. And we should be demanding better, not because our schools are failing, but because our schools are actually succeeding in spite of the lack of support. And so I think it's really important for me personally to make sure that I don't let the false narrative, the self-fulfilling prophecy, and I'll share that with our audience, that self-fulfilling prophecy bring us down and make us feel like quitting and walking away. We should be very, very, very angry right now that we're in a situation that our tax dollars are being spent in the way they are and have been hoarded in billions of dollars while we are facing a situation that could be fixed. Can we, one last thing that I just want to ask really quickly, Bryan, because you're with the largest teacher union in the state, you know, what does it look like in the next 5 years for teachers retiring in our system? Because somebody had asked me that earlier too, and I forgot to ask you, and I know we're wrapping up, but I got to sneak that in. Do we have a big bubble coming up that's getting of retirement age, on top of not pulling people in at the beginning of the pipeline through, you know, the reduced number of graduates coming out of school? Are we facing a large retirement population?
Well, Yvonne, you're smarter than me, and the way that you asked that question makes me believe that there is some data that says yes. Anecdotally, I could probably agree with you, but yeah, I mean, I'm sure that is true. I have not seen that number, but again, that's just because this is not the data world that I'm living in every single day. But
Right.
I 100%
Well, I did see something,
believe that.
Bryan, and I can't quote it either. And I really did thought you might have seen it recently, but a few years ago, one of the estimates that we were given from DPI before the current folks was that when they looked at the age and the number of years experience and so forth, they had predicted that in the next 5 years, we would lose another 20% to simply retirement. And so if you're reducing by 30%, I'm not a math major, by folks coming into the field, and you're losing over the next 5 years an additional 20%, you can see that this pipeline is getting in big trouble at both ends. Recruiting and retaining, and then retirement. So we've got three factors going on at one time. And so I think that why I say that is not to be discouraging to our audience, but to say how serious this issue is, and a call to arms, that we have to take this more serious than we've been taking it, and that we've got to be dedicated to doing something about it. So one of the things I want to end by saying is, first of all, Amanda and Bryan, this is a really important conversation. I really thank you both for being here tonight. I hope that we can entice you to come back again sometime and keep talking about this, because I think that Bryan really made it clear, and so did you, Amanda, that we've got to keep communicating to the public, no matter how discouraged they and power we're making these decisions make us feel. If we give up educating our public and being cheerleaders for our educators, we lose. So we have a right to demand better for our state, and we've got to keep doing it. And we have a lot to cheer about. We got to keep doing that too. So I don't invite you to go to our website, Public Schools First NC. I want you to look under. There's a lot of resources here, a lot of data. If you'd like to submit a blog article, or if you want to us to post something for you in our newsletter, which goes out to 100,000 folks, and we'll do it. But here I want to bring to your attention really quickly is our petition page. We are hoping that maybe tonight when you get off this call that you'll go and click on petition, and I hope that you will join us in sending a message to the General Assembly. And you can copy any of this you want and share it with your county commissioners and school board too, by the way. Okay, but we're asking you to go and sign our petition to support North Carolina teachers. And there's more narrative there. You can feel free to take this. Everything on our website we have created to give to you, our public. So you can take it and use it as your own. Take our words and reprint them if you want, but we really want you to help us this week. We're going to be sending this petition out all across the state. People are running in primaries right now. There's a lot of people running for office. You should be asking them where they stand on these issues. I invite you to also go to our website and look for we've got 13 questions you ought to ask everybody running for office about, and if they can't answer these questions for you about public education, maybe you can reconsider your vote. We have a questionnaire that we're inviting candidates to fill out. And we're inviting, if they fill it out, we'll post it. And you can welcome to come back and look to see where different candidates are saying. The last thing I'll say is that we have a really special workshop coming up in a couple of weeks on special education. Amanda, you mentioned earlier schools who don't even have a special education teacher now. That's going on all across the state. And in some schools right now, when there is a special ed teacher, instead of teaching a ratio of 10 to 12 kids, they have 20 to 25 kids because they can't get instructional support people, right? They can't get a teacher's assistant in the classroom, Bryan. We can't even hire these folks, and there are not enough of them. So I do want to encourage you to come back in a couple of weeks and help us talk about this issue, because this, again, is something that we as a public should demand that is a condition in our state that should not be allowed. We should have more special education teachers. We need to pay them better. We need to have instructional support people in that classroom for every single child. And no child should be in a situation where they're in a classroom by themselves with often a substitute special teacher, not a special ed teacher, and with 20 and 25 kids. But so as Bryan was saying earlier, look at this as an example of them setting up a scenario that looks like we're failing our children. But who is failing our children, folks? Who is failing our children? Who created this situation? So this is something really important to me. Everything that we talked about tonight, we've taped. It's going to be on our YouTube channel. I hope all of you that came, that you'll share it. I want to encourage you again to follow us and tweet us and like us and all those terms. Bryan knows social media. So I want you to do this because we want to make sure that we're sharing the information with all of our public. So follow us, like us, and share and contribute to our organization. We care very deeply about this subject. And in closing, I want to say that the one thing that all of us know is that we are where we are today because there was a teacher or a group of teachers who put us in a situation that we were capable of learning and being successful and learning skills, and that we could turn into jobs for ourselves, right? So we appreciate our educators. I'm going to let the last word be to Amanda and Bryan, if you have one last thing, and then we're going to sign off, because I really hold you in such high regard. I thank you so much for being here. Your dialogue tonight was brilliant, and I hope a lot of people will listen to what you're saying.
I'll be quick because Bryan seems to be the more long-winded of the two of us, but we're both social studies teachers. So I just want to say thank you so much for everybody who was here tonight, and public schools first, because this is the start of the conversation, and this is how things are going to move forward. And I think just drawing attention to what I do believe is a crisis that doesn't have a positive end in sight right now, and there's still a lot of work to do. This is where it starts, and so just want to say thank you, and I hope that this dialogue at least goes forward into conversation tomorrow in support for public schools.
Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, just want to say thanks to Yvonne and Lynn and the Public Schools First team. I got to meet a sister. I got to meet Amanda as a result of this conversation. So I'm really excited to have connected with her. And also, Amanda, just thank you for what you're doing every day, right? Like being a good quality school principal is like it's a real treat. And I'm sure your folks are really, really grateful for how you show up for them. Yeah, and I just, I think we got a lot of work to do. But I think it's a good set of folks in this room, seemingly from, a number of places around the state. And to Lynn and Yvonne, thanks for always holding the space, and creating the opportunity for folks to learn from each other. Yeah, I just feel really lucky to have gotten to participate. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Bryan. And on that last note, I will tell you, anyone watching tonight, Lynn and I love being on Zoom together. So if you want us to come talk to your PTA group, your school board, your county commissioner, your church group, your civic group, your synagogue group about what's going on in North Carolina and how they can support our public education system, we are willing. So, just send us an email, info@Public Schools First NC, and we'll set up a special workshop presentation for you. So good night, everybody. Thank you. And let's get busy. We got a lot to do. Bye-bye.